What's going on? I'm Cole. If you are looking for some must read books, then you have found the perfect video because I'm talking about everything that I read throughout the month of June and July. Earlier last year, or maybe even this year, I started posting about this on my blog, but I figured as I'm starting to bring this channel back, this might be a better place to kind of talk about some of the books that I'm reading, what I enjoyed about them, and what I didn't enjoy about them. Normally, I'm going to do this on a monthly basis, but I got behind on my blog, so I figure why not just make a video and cover all these books right now. So, what we're going to do is we're going to start with the month of June. And the first book we read in June was The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Volume 1. This is from writer Jason Aaron, and there are different artists on every single issue of this trade. This trade is called Return to New York, and it is great. If you are a fan of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I highly recommend reading this because it is kind of a new start to this. While I think, when it comes to the IDW run of Turtles, I think this is kind of all continuous. The idea of this issue or this volume was that you can kind of start here and go, and from then I've just started. I've really enjoyed it. I think I'm caught up almost to where they are in the actual story on the single issue comics, but overall I think this is great. If you're a fan of turtles or comics or even superheroes, I think this is worth checking out. If you are a 90s kid who has some Ninja Turtles nostalgia, I think that this can even hit a point for you because there are a lot of they show how the turtles grow here, and it's very interesting to see. I know, the issue with Michelangelo kind of shows how this party dude kind of can be sad sometimes. And Jason Aaron does a really good job of, building these characters, making them something new and fresh. And maybe they've been like this in the stories, and I just haven't read it. But for me, this really hit all the boxes that I wanted in a comic book. I know I actually will probably maybe post down below. I wrote a full review of it. So if you're interested in kind of seeing how I felt about that, go check that out. I think this is really good. And I think for any Turtles fan, this is something that you could enjoy. All right. And book two for June is Wake Up and Open Your Eyes. Is from Clay McLeod Chapman. I really thoroughly enjoyed this book. This is what we talked about in Blake and I do a book club, and this was our book club book of June. It seemed to have very mixed reviews. The idea of this is it's kind of this satire, political satire book that it mixes in some very gruesome horror elements. I know there's some very weird body horror stuff. I know that there's a scene here specifically that's pretty gruesome that depicts somebody putting their hand into a blender, and you're reading this and you're like thinking, how do I turn this off? But as you're reading it, you can't really stop because it's all inside of your brain itself. But I can understand why people don't like this book. There's certain things where I think the narrators in this get kind of odd. I know, one of them is Anderson Cooper throughout it, and I think it's kind of funny. It reminded me of, if you ever played the video game The Stanley Parable. It's just kind of the silly narrator throughout it. That part can get there. I know some people said some of these things seem repetitive, but mainly what this book focuses on is how social media or the news can kind of get people to fall into these kind of trance, right? So you're kind of brought into this place and you're just going through. And they take it to a very big extreme, right, where it starts to become this sort of horror thing. But I think this does a very good job of telling the story that it was trying to tell, and I really enjoyed it. I know, for people that might be smarter than me, there might be some narratives on here of what this really is. But I mean, overall, this is just a political satire book, and covers a lot of body horror stuff too. So some of that can get pretty gross. But most of the people didn't seem to say that the stuff that was gross was what they didn't like, just kind of that some of this became repetitive. And while maybe I can understand that, I really enjoyed it. I know towards the end, when there's this apocalyptic part of the book, it goes through these YouTube videos, and some people said, hey, some of these were kind of boring and some of them were kind of good. But I think that's just kind of how it is, right? When you kind of are digesting media that isn't what you want, sometimes there are going to be stuff that isn't meant for you. And I think that's kind of what's good about this. So while I wouldn't really recommend this to everyone, if you like horror and you're looking for something something kind of funny and political, I think this is a very big recommend. And the third book from June is The Outsiders by Stephen King. This is a book I was listening to the audiobook, and it's actually my second listen, but I kind of had forgotten about it. So, throughout the years, I'll listen to some audiobooks. Sometimes, I think just some of the stuff I remember the beginning, but I didn't really remember the end. So part of me actually wonders, did I actually finish this audiobook, or did I just start it and maybe mark it off in Goodreads? A lot of the times I know, like as I'm looking in this and logging this, it says that it's a two-time one. I really enjoyed this book. I think it's really good. This is kind of the follow-up to that Mr. Mercedes trilogy. We get Holly again, and it's just kind of this supernatural mystery detective book. And if that's something that you like, I think this is really good. I think once again, there are some very uh, there are some trigger warnings in this. I know that there's some very gruesome stuff, especially done towards children. It doesn't really go over them, but when you're going through the crime scenes, you can kind of get some of that. So once again, I think this book is maybe, again, not for everyone, but if you like Stephen King, I would say go check out the Mr. Mercedes trilogy. And if you want to keep going, this seems like a place to go. You can kind of start here, but there's a lot of good in there, and you'll get a lot of the background of Holly, which I think is important if you want to kind of keep going down this road. And the fourth book that I read in June is the October Film Haunt. This is from Michael Wehunt. This is a book that I actually got as a advanced review copy from NetGalley. I will probably be posting a review about that somewhere, either on my blog or here. This one doesn't come out for a little bit longer, so I've kind of been waiting as I've had some other stuff to come out. But I thoroughly enjoyed this book. The idea is that there is this blog, right? And these people create these stories about going to the locations of some of these horror stories, and then they kind of fabricate the story, and it kind of creates this spiral of people kind of going to do what they did. Some bad things happen because of that, and now they're kind of rolling into this where they're kind of trying to bring back that movie that they fabricated this at, but they're also making this kind of a found footage version of it, and it's taking place with some of the people who ran that blog, and it's very good. I mean, this is a horror book that kind of crosses over a few different ways. You're kind of wondering who really is doing this, but you're not really given all the information. But I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I think it's very good. It was one of the first books that I think I remember seeing the author posting on Threads, like, hey, did you know that this is the second most requested book on NetGalley right now? So when I saw that, I put it on, or I think it was the second most requested horror book on NetGalley. So very niche, but overall, I think this is a good book. If you're looking for something, I think, I talk about the movie or the book Horror Movie, which is one of my favorite books of the year so far. I think if you read that book and you're like, I wish that there was more action in this book. I wish that this did more. I wish that this wasn't just like what it was. I think this would be the perfect book to kind of go through and read, because I think you'll really enjoy this. I think that what this book does is it moves, and it was more based on the plot, less on just building this weird, creepy, eerie feeling that you're getting. So yeah, if you read Horror Movie and it wasn't for you, I think this would be great. If you read Horror Movie and you loved it, I think you'd still enjoy this. Once again, this is a horror book. I read a lot of horror stuff, but I think that, this is one that can kind of maybe get out of that horror realm. Some of the bad guy is more of a slasher, which kind of maybe mixes it more into that crime background. But I think overall, this is a good book. And if any of the stuff I said, you like that, I highly recommend checking this out. And the final book I read in June is All System Red. If you've been watching the show, The Murderbot Show, this is what that is based off of. This is a pretty quick read. I think it's like 125 pages on my Kobo, which when I read digitally, I don't always know what that transcends into for the printed book, but I've seen copies of this book, and it's pretty small. It seems like it is a novella, but this was fun. I don't love sci-fi, but I think this is a good adaptation of what I like in sci-fi. There aren't a ton of characters. There's a few, but it's kind of focusing this robot, and also I don't love robots, but it's kind of very funny to see this robot. He kind of dubs himself this Murderbot because his goal is he's kind of a security droid, and he's supposed to be protecting the ship, but somehow his governor gets broken. and he can feel emotions and he doesn't have to do what they do. So it's very interesting. He kind of helps this team survive this mission, and because of that, they're kind of getting him to join their team. So I think this is something that I'm probably going to keep catching up on these books. I know when I went to check out the other one, there was a big hold at my library, so I have to wait a little bit, but overall, I will continuously go down this path. These are pretty quick. I know it took me about 2 times at the gym on the elliptical for an hour to finish this book. So I'm a pretty slow reader. So I think most people can probably crush one of these in a sitting. But if you're looking for something, fun, fast, and has a lot of stuff to kind of go through, this might be that book for you. Once again, it is sci-fi. Um, which is a little bit different for me, but I've been trying to mix it up a little bit and put some new stuff in with what I'm reading just to make it a little bit fresh. So, again, in June, the 5 books that I read were the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Volume 1 Return to New York, Wake Up and Open Your Eyes, The Outsider, The October Film Haunt, and All Systems Red. If I were to recommend just one of these books to you, it's really hard. I think there's a lot of good stuff here, but I honestly might just have to give it to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Volume 1. I think, while the horror stuff I really liked, and both of those books were very good, I think that this book is just kind of something that really hit, right? For comics, this is top tier comics. If you don't love comics, but you love the Turtles, I think this is something you can easily digest. I know the Volume 1 is on Hoopla, so if you use Hoopla through your local library, you can even check it out. Give it a try. If you don't love it, hey, you didn't really waste anything on it, but I think it's fun. And if you kind of want a nostalgia read, I think this might be the book for you. Now let's get into the books of the month of July that I read. First off, we have Diary of a CEO. This is from Stephen Bartlett. This is a very interesting book. It kind of goes over like 33 things that you should do to be a CEO, or just like kind of somebody, working up to management or something like that. One of the things that I really like to do, I work in tech. I like to follow books based on tech and just kind of general management style books, just to get kind of some of that overview and see, what works for people, what doesn't. I think, the funny thing is when you read some of these books, you always hear that there's no silver bullet. And I think this has a lot of good things in it, right? Of these 33 points, there's probably, 3 to 4 of them that could easily help you improve. Whether or not you're really going to take from that really, depends on yourself. But while this book wasn't anything crazy or good, I listened to it in the audiobook format, and I think in that aspect it works well for me, right? Something that while I'm on my drive to work, I can kind of listen to this, and maybe it's not really like the daily affirmations, but it's similar to that where you're getting something for yourself to help improve yourself, right? So while this might not be for everyone, if you're looking kind of like, for more career-based style books, I think this is one that you can check out, within the first few ideas that he's giving out. You can tell if it's going to be for you. I know he does reference some like more like douchey tech people, and that's, whatever that's going to happen in some of these stuff. But, overall, I think there's some good ideas here. Is it a book that I think everyone needs to go out and read? Probably not. The next book up is Breathe In, Bleed Out. This is from Brian McAlley. And if you followed NetGalley, there was Camp NetGalley over the summer, and the idea was here's some free books that everyone can there's 20 books, anyone can pick one of them. You can check it out. They just ask that you review it by the end of August. You get a badge for doing it. So it's kind of this way to really promote some of these books, but also get people into NetGalley. Another thing they did is they promoted this bingo cards. So like, here's go through, find some stuff, figure out some things that you might like about NetGalley, learn about NetGalley, and kind of how to get these advanced review copies. And later on, I'll probably have a video going over some of the stuff with NetGalley just to explain it to people and hopefully get some more people in there and maybe find some books to review. But this was one of the books that they got. I just kind of grabbed it because I think it was the only one that had horror in it. And boy, am I glad that I grabbed it. This book was fantastic. I think, when I read through it, the idea is it's about this girl, right? She has this trauma with her fiance where when they're getting engaged, he dies. And you don't really know why, but you kind of gain some of it throughout it. She's been going to therapy throughout the year. She's been having trouble as she kind of becomes trying to become a doctor. I know she's an orderly right now. And there's certain things where like she's having some issues. She has some issues on the job. And her therapist is telling her that she should kind of like be herself, spend some time with herself. And she ends up relinking with some friends, going on this trip of this like, to this, it's like a therapeutic learning place, off the grid, no phones, blah, 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 blah. So when they get there, things start turning, people start to slowly die. This book does a great job of like building these characters that like you both like feel for, but also like some of them you're like, I hope that they're the next one because they're just very annoying, right? But they're kind of these stereotypical and not like in a bad way, but characters in, a horror slasher book or movie. And, the funny thing is when you finish the book, you read the note about the author and he bases a lot of this off of Scream, talking about how like Scream is the first book, like horror movie that he loved. And this book really showcases that. I think it does like the idea of like where Scream has this whodunit where the whole time you're kind of wondering who's Ghostface. This book does the same thing, right? And it's at the very end, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even see that coming. So it's very good, right? You're kind of thinking all these different ways. But I think if you're like, hey, I like the movie Scream. I don't really read horror. I think this is a good book, right? It's not too overly gruesome. There are some gruesome deaths in this, but nothing too crazy, right? If you read something like a Reacher book or anything like that, you've probably read crazier stuff in that. But overall, I think this book is great. I'm very excited that I got it. I didn't think it was going to be good. I didn't love like the cover image or anything like that, but this book really hit for me. And I think it's kind of like this example, right, of like what you can kind of get in books. I think this is a great, slasher whodunit that really, they're making movies like this, right? But for some reason, it just seemed to hit so good in this book. And I'm really thankful that this was one of the ideas and that this is the one that I picked from Camp NetGal. And the next book we have is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. This is from V.E. Schwab. I've heard a lot of people talk about Schwab on Threads and other places. They really like her work. And this is one that always comes up. So I ended up getting the audiobook of this and I really enjoyed this. So this is, I think, a fantasy book. It's kind of funny as we kind of talk about stuff and I talk about the stuff that I'm reading. This is kind of like one of those books where it's like, I wonder, is this considered a romance? And like at the end of the day, I think it's looked as a fantasy with romance elements, but this is a very good book. It kind of deals with Addie LaRue as this girl who is forced to get married. And she doesn't want to. So she makes a deal with the devil. And the idea is that she can kind of not have to go through this and she can live for an eternity. The only issue is that no one remembers her. So, it's kind of this sad, like poetically sad thing. When somebody leaves the room to go to the bathroom, they might come back and be like, who are you? I don't know who you are, right? Imagine trying to get a job when somebody can't remember who you are, right? So she just lives this life, and then throughout this, somebody else, I don't want to get into it, but she finds somebody that can maybe remember her, and I think it kind of deals with this idea, and it's one of those where the whole time you're thinking, oh my gosh, how is this going to end? And then it ends very differently than maybe you want, but I think it's still beautifully told. It gives you a great story. Whether you like fantasy, romance, I think both of those elements can come through here strong, and I think it's worth checking out. I really love this book. It's not really in my wheelhouse too much. It was a little bit different, but it's also just kind of showcases good writing, right? So I enjoyed it. This is, I think I want to say it was like an 18-hour audiobook, which is fairly long. And throughout it all, like, there weren't really too many points where you're like, this is too long, right? Like I know, like I've talked about Reacher books and stuff. Like there's certain times where it's like, did we need this whole section? Probably not, but it's there, so we're going to deal with it. This book seemed very smart in the way that it did it. And yeah, it's just interesting. You kind of go through the time periods, see new things. And yeah, I think it's good. I think, if you're looking for a book, I think this is one, maybe check it out because it really applies to most people. And I think it's really good. And the next book up for July is When the Wolf Comes Home. This is by Nat Cassidy. This is another book that Blake and I had for our book club. I would say the one thing that I would say might be an issue for this book for me personally is that, I was reading the physical book, and a lot of my reading throughout this month has been, the last few months have been on the elliptical, and I just sweat a ton, and I don't want to like get sweaty on a physical book. So it took me a little bit longer to read this, but I was kind of doing a chapter a day, 2 chapters a day, occasionally maybe more. And this book is great. It really like covers a lot. So the idea is that this girl essentially is having the worst night of her life. in a dirty bathroom. She ends up stabbing her finger with a syringe. And while she's going to kind of go and check out, hey, what happened with me? She ends up finding a small boy in her backyard and like just dealing with him and like what ensues from here. You look at the cover of this and you think, oh my gosh, this is just a werewolf book. And it kind of starts off that way, but it is so much more than a werewolf book. But without like kind of spoiling a lot of like what happened, there are some supernatural elements to this boy, and it's written very well. And I know Nat Cassidy will talk about it in the back of the book about like, some of the stuff that he was going from and how he talked about this book. I know this is another book that in our book club, I know there are certain people that didn't finish it, but I feel like most of the people that did finish it seem to love it. So it's kind of interesting, right? There was some writing in here where, like, I know, like, the first chapter is called, like, all fathers are assholes or something like that. So me, a father, I read that and I'm like, this is very sad. And the first chapter was rough for me, right? It's just about this awful dad, right? It depicts this picture of what we're supposed to think about this character. And it's hard. But, as you keep reading, it kind of goes throughout there more. There is some abuse issues in here with this child to kind of, it works on the story, right? But and kind of what this child is kind of confusing. But I think this book is worth checking out. It is, a lot of people talk about Nat Cassidy, and I think this is kind of one of these books that can showcase how good of a writer he is. And while it might not be the easiest to digest book, I think it's written so well, and I think that there's a lot of cool stuff in here. I know that there were some parts in here that kind of seem silly to me. There's this whole section where like they're talking about the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but they can actually not name Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So like you're reading it and you're like, this is kind of whatever. But this book is very good, and it's very different from what I'm used to reading. It's also like when you get the physical book, it's a little like differently formatted. It's like wider than a standard book, which is interesting. But once again, this is horror. I think it's worth reading. It's not like, I don't think really there's anything like, the scary parts are more like psychologically scary than they are like boo scary, right? So I love this book. I dig this book. This is, another book that we covered in our book club, and we're just kind of seeing what people are talking about. So if you do have any really good like horror recommendations that you think we should check out, leave them down below. I'll make sure we kind of add them. I'll also probably have a link to our book club. We do that on Fable. So if you're interested in joining a spooky book club, join us. We usually talk on Fable. The good thing we like about it is that you can kind of post per chapter. You don't really have to, you can kind of come in and out whenever you want. If you don't want to talk, you don't have to, but you can. And really, you only see those messages on the ones that you've been, or it'll just show up like somebody posted in here. So you don't actually have to go to it and spoil yourself either. And the final book that I read in July was Future Proof. This is from Kevin. I think it's pronounced Bruce. This book is about AI and like what you can kind of do with AI. I think it's kind of this idea of like not getting yourself lost in the AI and how like AI can be maybe helpful and not helpful, and what ways it is and isn't. As I said, I've worked in tech, and I know that like AI is kind of this very controversial topic right now. A lot of people hate AI, especially for what it's doing in creative spaces, and I think that's fair. I think this book does a good job of talking about how like those creative spaces are never going to really be ran or taken over by AI. But it's also very just interesting to see of like where can AI work and where does AI not? Is this book for everyone? Probably not. But if you work in a job that focuses on AI, I think this has some good points, right? It's trying to show you that like it's interesting on some of the studies, like do it people and AI work well together, or is AI better to be by itself and people are better to be by itself? And it really kind of talks about a lot of different stuff. One of the things that they kind of explained in this book too that was interesting is the writer noticed that he was using a lot of time on his phone, so he put a rubber band on. Rubber band adds this is like the speed bump so that he's not on his phone as much, and it's like a very interesting concept. Tried it out and it does seem to work because you're kind of being annoyed as you have to move this rubber band while you text, but it's a very interesting concept. But I would say this book, if you're in tech and you're looking for something that's more like, how do we work with AI, or AI, and how will AI work with us? I think this is a good idea. check this book out. Once again, I listened to the audiobook. I think it's like 6 hours. There's some decent stuff in here. Is it for everyone? No, but neither is AI. And I think, overall, I know that it's not going to take over all these creative spaces, but I think like the good thing is that, there are some positive things that can come out of this. And this book kind of maybe will help kind of showcase some of it. And while I was looking at my list, I realized that I skipped one of the first books that I read from this month. So another book that I read in July is The Wrong Sister. This is from Claire Douglas. This is another book that I got an advanced reader copy of from NetGalley. It is this thriller that kind of deals with these two sisters, right? One of them is married with two kids, kind of lives in her hometown. The other one moved away, has a very big career, is married to a tech entrepreneur, and she decides that she's going to let her other sister go to their townhouse in Italy and watch her kids while they're gone. The sister's husband dies while they're watching the kid, and this whole mystery starts of like, what happened here? How did this happen? But the reason why it's called The Wrong Sister is they also had a sister who was kidnapped when they were a kid. So it's got all these webs, all these layers. I started reading like thrillers and mysteries, so it was really nice for me to get back into this and kind of like refreshing, right? I'd read some very deep horror books, which can't always be fun, right? Not everything you read is going to be fun. I think this kind of let me kind of turn it off and just kind of go through a book, right? We're on tracks. We're going to figure out what happened. I'm just going to let it do its magic. And I think this was a very nice surprise for me. If you're looking for a new thriller, this book, I think it might be out by now. Maybe it's not. I'll probably have the date there when it comes out. But overall, I really enjoyed this book. I think it was good. I'm glad that I checked it out because it was something a little bit different. And like I said, I'm trying to read different things. And I think this was kind of the good example. I would say the only real issue I had with this book is that it's written in like uh, British English. And so there were certain words I know, like for baby stroller, they said prom or parm or something. Forget what they called it, but I had to like Google what does this mean because it was like I don't understand exactly. But either way, I really like this book. I think it's good. And it is definitely worth checking out. So again, in July, we read 6 books. We read The Wrong Sister, The Diary of a CEO, Breathe In, Bleed Out, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, Future Proof, and When the Wolf Comes Home. This is a very hard one for me because I feel like The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue should be the book that I talk about here, but I'm going to say it's Breathe In, Bleed Out. That book just hit everything for me. And I think it's a great book that like I sometimes try to step away from always recommending horrors because I know that I like horror books, but I know that not everyone likes horror books. I think that while this might be like somebody that's very squeamy and doesn't like horror at all, and not in any sort of way, maybe not. But if you're like, I read thrillers, I read mysteries, like this isn't really that different. I think this is a very accessible horror book that I think gets a lot of the elements of horrors where there's kind of this like campy funniness to it, but there's also these big kills that are very good, but there's also this whodunit mystery in it that you're trying to figure out. So I know that I try and like push away, even though I'm going to be digesting a lot of horrors. And I know they're from me. I think if you had to read one of these books, like The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue was a safe pick. But if you're like, I don't love horror, I think Breathe In might be a good idea for something to try because I don't think that it's going to be too much of anything. And maybe it'll open your love for this genre a little bit. So, that was kind of maybe a sneaky way of doing too. But overall, I think this one is very good and it's really worth checking out, especially if you're kind of like, I would want to try some new genres. This might be that way. So another thing I really like to do when I was writing this as a blog is I'd also talk about some of the books that I'm planning to read for the next month. So for the month of August, which we're in right now, I know one of the books for sure that I'm going to read is The Only Good Indian. This is the book that Blake and I are covering in our book club. So I'm excited to read this. I know that the author, I think it's Stephen Jones Graham, is very big right now. A lot of people are talking about his book, especially like the Buffalo Hunter. Hunter is really big, and he just released another book that is like 2 books in one. But I'm excited to check this one out. I've not read anything from this author, so it'll be fun and new and a little bit different. And another book is Catching Fire from the Hunger Games, and I'll probably even finish the Hunger Games series. I think at the time of recording this, I am mostly finished with Catching Fire. So I'm definitely going to finish that, and I'm probably going to move on because it's been very good. I've been reading The Hunger Games just because I've been trying to find books that I can like read with my daughter as she gets older. I've never read The Hunger Games. I watched the movie about 10 years ago or whenever they came out, but I forgot a lot of this. So like reliving this book has been so good, and it is very good. I've also been sort of reading Project Hail Mary. So depending on the time frame, that's a fairly long book. Hopefully, maybe I can get through that one too. But I'd love to know, what books did you love in June and July, and what books are you planning to read in August? As always, if you have any horror books, that is my go-to genre, but I really want to try other things too. So recommend anything to me. I like to try new things. And two, let me know the format you like to read into for these kind of things, because I know certain books they might say like, oh, hey, this book is better in digital or audiobook because it's got such great narrators. But either or, that's what it is. And hopefully, if you came here and read this or watched this, one of these books will sound good to you, and maybe you can add something to your to read list. As always, I've been Cole. Peace.